Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today we have the honor of hearing a story from Kellay Chapman. In the story, Kellay is 10 years old and her brother is 15. Sometimes other family members take up so much emotional space in your home that there is no space left for your emotions. The result is that you can be made responsible for the emotions of other family members. You can be responsible for regulating their affect, but left utterly alone when you are dysregulated and in need of care. This is a horrible bind for a child to be put in. Before we dive into the interview with Kellay, please consider supporting the podcast financially by going to adamyoungcounseling.com and clicking on podcast. You can contribute as little as $3 per month, and you will receive episodes as soon as they are released and help support the podcast and help make it possible. Thank you. Here's my interview with Kellay. I'm here with Kellay Chapman. Kellay, it's good to see you.
You too, Adam.
Say a bit about yourself, where you are geographically, what you do with your life, that sort of thing.
So I live in Raleigh, North Carolina with my husband, who's a nurse, which is very interesting in these times. Have a 2.5-year-old. We're expecting our second daughter at the end of May. For work, I am the director of operations for the church that we go to. And I am a facilitator with the Allender Center, which is how I met you.
And so we're going to talk a little bit about story before you read one of your stories. What prompted you to begin engaging your own story? Like, how did your journey with story begin?
It actually began in my early 20s. I'm in my early 30s now. In my early 20s, my dad actually started exploring his story. And in learning things about him, it was the first time I realized there was a reason people were the way they were. Kind of the company line in my family is everybody just is the way they are. So in hearing from him, I realized, oh, wow, there's a lot of things from my childhood that make a lot more sense, knowing some of his history of harm. So that was the first time I kind of considered that we all have a story. And then in 2011, my parents were in an accident where they were walking and were hit by a car. They were hit by a drunk driver, and they both ended up in the ICU, and it was a very intense and traumatic experience. And at the time, I thought it was my first encounter with trauma. And I knew of the Allender Center, or Dan Allender, from my dad had given me the book, The Wounded Heart. So I knew of him and started listening to him. And then I heard through that about the certificate program. And I knew that what I was experiencing was something like trauma. I had been their kind of first responder and taking care of all of their medical needs and things like that, and was really struggling to go back to work. So I thought, well, I'll go do this certificate program thing, thinking they'll help me with what I'm dealing with right now. But through that, started to learn, oh, I have a story. And this is not my first encounter with trauma, and realized, in fact, there was a lot of reenactment going on, things I had actually experienced before. So once I did the first weekend of certificate, it kind of opened my eyes to my whole story, my growing up story. And then I was hooked, I would say. Since then, I just kept doing the next program.
You mentioned the word reenactment. You said that when your parents were so traumatized medically and you were experiencing trauma from all of that, there was something of reenactment going on. What do you mean when you say reenactment?
I think of reenactment as we have all experienced harm and trauma, and those experiences tend to replay, kind of get stuck in our brain, right? And so we're trying to work things out, and we end up in similar situations because of patterns formed out of harm, I would say. So for me, it was very much a reenactment to be in charge in a situation where I really didn't know what I was doing. I'm the youngest of 3 kids by 5 years, but I was the one who was looked to take care of everything. So though this was a very new situation, them being in the hospital and hurt in this way, I definitely went into really familiar patterns of having to take care without probably the proper tools.
So an immense burden was placed on you, and it was a familiar burden.
Yes. And I had familiar ways of coping with that.
So as you start engaging your story at the certificate program, or as you continue to, what were some of the obstacles that got in the way of you making progress or just going deeper?
Yeah, that's a great question. For one thing, by that time, my parents had enrolled at the Seattle school and were in the process of becoming therapists. And another kind of theme for me is this idea that my family and my parents are perfect. And they get to tell the story. So it was an obstacle in that all of a sudden everyone I was around who I was trying to get help from also knew my parents. So this sense of, can I really tell the truth? And will I be believed? Probably more. I can tell my truth, but will these people believe me who, in some sense, I feel like have been taken in by my parents, by kind of their charisma. And so knowing that they were spending time with Dan Allender, that they were spending time with my facilitator, that was a big obstacle. I would say in my family, my mom got to control the narrative for everyone. And so that was another obstacle I felt like I was up against. I can tell her version of events and maybe get something out of this. But this kind of question rose of what would happen if I told my version.
There was a sense of my mom's story and her perspective is like the true perspective.
Yes. I always felt like I was lying if I said anything outside of what she would say.
Wow. So is now a good time for you to read your story?
Yes. As a 10-year-old girl with an absent father and fairly unpredictable mother, I worshipped my 15-year-old charismatic brother. He was handsome and popular, and our family was seen as a model Christian family. At the time, I thought my parents were perfect, Jesus-loving people. Anytime I felt negative emotions, I was filled with guilt that I didn't live up to the standard the rest of my family held. I knew sometimes I would get highly upset or agitated with my brother, but interpreted that as my fault. In my understanding, my brother could do no wrong, so anytime I was upset with him, it was some failing on my part. On this particular day, my brother had agreed to come outside with me. It usually took a lot of coaxing to get him to do something I wanted to do instead of doing whatever he wanted to do. So I imagine I had done a lot of work to get him to come outside this sunny day. I think it was summer. I know it was warm, and I was wearing a Kellay green dress with matching shorts. The top of the dress had embroidered blue flowers. We lived on a fairly secluded, large piece of land. A creek ran through our front yard, and I remember standing with him in front of the creek. And the next thing I remember is being dragged by my wrist through the yard. It was too much weight on my wrists, and I felt scared. I could feel roots and rocks against my back as I was dragged through the yard. Eventually, the dragging stopped, and my brother pinned me down on my back. He lodged my hips between his knees and pinned my hands down above my head. Then he began sucking his tongue, and my stomach twisted in fear and dread. Slowly, he let saliva out of his mouth, somehow keeping it dangling over my face. He let it dangle and then sucked it back into his mouth over and over again. Finally, he let it fall in my face. Then he laughed a loud, mirthless laughter I was well acquainted with. His face was so red and his mouth opened wide as he laughed. The laughter had a heaving quality to it, and I can see clearly as I write the way his eyes would crinkle at the edges when he laughed this way. It was the way he laughed when he was successfully humiliating someone. When he finally let me up, I ran into our house, sure he had gone far enough to get in trouble this time. I ran to my mom, who seemed to be coming towards us. I even had the feeling she had seen what had happened. Her face was angry, but she offered no comfort to me. I told her my brother had spit in my face, and she sneered at him. She told me I could sip lemonade while he mowed the lawn next time. My brother became upset and started to yell. I assured everyone it was all fine, and I didn't need any retribution, and went to my room. My brother had to mow the lawn as a chore anyway, so what my mom offered was not a punishment for him, and the idea that I could somehow gloat while he did a chore he didn't like to make up for what he had just done to me, made me feel nauseous. I didn't want to gloat. I wanted there to be someone strong enough to stop him. There wasn't, and there never would be.
Thank you, Kellay.
Mm-hmm.
So is it okay if we go back through and talk about different parts of it?
Yes.
You begin the story by telling us some really important pieces of background. You tell us that the 10-year-old girl has an absent father,
Mm-hmm.
an unpredictable mother,
Mm-hmm.
and that you worshipped your brother, who's 5 years older than you. So you're 10, he's 15, and you worshipped this charismatic brother. Any sense of how did you come to worship your brother?
It's funny, that's where you start, because those are the sentences that I had the most, like, can I say that? Feelings around. I was always told I can presume by my mother that my brother was kind of the fill-in for my dad. So my dad was literally there in our home, but I don't have many memories of him talking even. Like, he was just a very, very quiet, kind of disengaged man. My mom called it dispassionate. And she would talk about that my brother was passionate. So I feel like she very much kind of offered him to me as a father figure, which I think contributed to me kind of worshiping him. And he was, and I would think still is, very charismatic, like very kind of life of the party, and was older than me, right? So I had had so many experiences of being with him, with other people, where he was just loved. Like, he could just walk in a room and charm everyone. I think the way my mom framed our relationship added to that. And then I think just seeing other people, how they reacted to him. And I had this sense of pride of like, and he's my brother. So, I must be so lucky. I have a sister who's older than both of us. And my brother, in some ways, I think chose me over my sister, or kind of favored me in his kind of fatherly role. And so that also made me feel special, and like almost, I think in some ways too, like I owe him, he's chosen me and I need to kind of idolize him in return.
But sometimes, you write in your story, sometimes you'd get upset with him.
Yes.
And you would always interpret that as your fault.
Yes.
And what you write is, in my understanding, my brother could do no wrong. So anytime I was upset with him, it was some failing on my part. How did you come to conclude that your brother could do no wrong and that you were always somehow at fault?
Probably a lot of factors coming together. But I know as an adult and through the work I've done that he was very volatile. So a lot of that was just, if it was my fault, it was a lot easier to appease him and keep him calm. So I was very well attuned to what he wanted and what he needed. And one of the things he needed was to never be wrong or at fault. And that's not actually possible. So I think just in my child mind, how I was able to make sense of that was like, well, I can be wrong because I'll be okay. But our home will be hell if he's wrong or he gets upset.
So as a 10-year-old girl, you are already very attuned to this 15-year-old brother.
Yes.
You know what's happening on his insides. You know when he's feeling volatile. You know when he's feeling shame. Like, you're a 10-year-old girl, but you have an immense capacity to attune to this brother, yes?
Yes. And I know it's my job to do that for everyone, like on behalf of everyone in the family.
Say more about that.
Like, I have memories of seeing my mom ask him to do a chore at a certain moment, or my sister make a comment and knowing like, oh, you should not have said that. Like, this is not going to go well. He's about to start yelling. And at the time feeling just bamboozled. How do they not know what they're supposed to say and do? Or how do they not realize, that this is going to set him off?
You just seemed to know.
Right. That's how it felt. I just know.
Right. And looking back now, how do you understand this knowing of that girl?
I mean, I think a lot of it was a dynamic created by my mother. I think she was probably overwhelmed by him. And so found ways to almost like diffuse that anxiety. Like if I can find someone to kind of be the container for him, I won't have to deal with this. Looking back, I feel like I was in some ways trained by my mother to read him and handle him for her or to keep him calm.
And whether it was training or you had some innate gifting and sensitivity, the bottom line is that you became a container for your brother's volatility so that your mother would not have to mother your brother.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, where my brain went was just thinking, and where was my dad? My mom is protecting a lot of people, I think, in this scenario, like protecting herself from having to mother and my father from having to father. But I am not one of the people that's protected.
Which is a really important sentence.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a place I've come back to a lot as an adult, as I've done my own work, is I'll often think, and I was the littlest one.
By a lot. I mean, there's a big difference between a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
And there's a bigger difference between a 10-year-old and a mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet you were bearing the parental task of providing some measure of containment for your brother's 15-year-old adolescent self.
Yeah.
And in that, you were left unprotected.
Yes. And I think that's where a lot of my work has been. I kind of knew I had a lot of responsibility, but I didn't think of myself as unprotected until I started doing reading actual stories to other people and seeing their reactions.
And so what's that been like for you, Kellay, to begin to realize that it's not merely that I was this hyper responsible girl, it's also that I was left unprotected?
Mm-hmm. In some ways, it's a little bit crazy making. There's a lot of gaslighting in my story. So to have heard my whole life, like you had such a wonderful family and I wish your parents were my parents and, you're also wonderful. And then to start to grapple with not being protected sometimes makes me feel crazy or like, oh, maybe I'm not telling this story right. Like it wasn't so bad. That is what happened. But, and I get in these like foggy kind of spirals. Sometimes it makes me feel angry. And I think the way my family has grown into our adulthood has also reinforced some of the anger because from my perspective, everyone in my family is still really committed to wanting me to provide the same things for my brother. So to realize like, this is not a question of, is Kellay willing to like reconcile our family? But this remains a question of like me not being protected and like my parents not wanting to, they would rather have my brother happy than have me protected still. And I can see that more clearly sometimes now, like in my adult life than I can when I look back, or it feels more true in a body sense. It's hard to get there with my small self.
As the story continues, your brother is bent on your humiliation. And it seems that your brother humiliating someone has happened before. You know the way he laughs when he's humiliating someone. How have you come to learn at this age, as a 10-year-old girl, that your brother has a particular facial expression when he's humiliating someone?
My sense is that he very much would switch, like had a pretty stark, like he really, I don't fully know how to define all of it, but there was a kind of genuine kindness or fun side to him, which I think made that switch to looking to humiliate pretty stark, to where I could see. I saw him do it to other people a lot too. So I would see him do it to my older sister. I came to know he did that just by watching those switches. It almost felt like an appetite. It's like, oh, he's going to need, this sounds crazy, but like to feed. There would be a lull where like things were fun and good. But that would bring its own kind of anxiety of like, oh, he's going to need to, I wouldn't have thought of it this way, but to humiliate someone.
And so by the age of 10, you know what it's like to be humiliated by your brother. You know this has happened before.
Yes. Something that comes up for me strongly in this story is this sense of like, and he's never going to get in trouble. And it's hard for me to connect to like the fear and the hurt, but it just feels like almost not even a very deep sense of like, this is so unfair. I remember thinking so often as a kid, like if I did the things that my brother does, I would get in trouble.
Right. And how have you come to make sense of that disparity?
I mean, to be blunt and honest, I think that there was a lot of arousal structures at play between my mother and my brother. And so there was something she was getting out of him being able to humiliate, or kind of just his like blank check in life, that was like worth more to her than kind of holding everyone to a standard of kindness.
And when you say arousal structures between your mom and your brother, can you put some more words to that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. If we think about, that every family has some sort of erotic structure and that no marriage is perfect. When a marriage has any kind of ruptures, often the children are asked to come and fill. There were a lot of things that my parents weren't able to offer each other. So my mom looked to my brother for things that should have been looked to my dad, as far as treating him like an equal and kind of being like a surrogate spouse almost for her. So she had this, he was young, but in some sense, this man who was extremely engaged and had an opinion about everything and had a lot of attention to give. And I think the kind of stoicism of my father was really difficult and painful for her. And so she didn't want to give up, that she could get that intensity from my brother.
So there's an intense relationship between your mom and your brother. And your brother in some ways is everything your father is not. He's passionate. Your mom's word was passionate. And there was a connection between your mom and your brother. Mm-hmm. And the cost of that to you was that you were not the favored one. Your brother was.
Yes. But the narrative is actually like that my brother is the black sheep.
Right, which is absolute frickin' madness for that 10-year-old girl.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, the favored one is simultaneously the black sheep of the family that the younger sister has to take care of. This is madness. So in the story, you write, my brother became upset and started to yell. I assured everyone it was all fine and I didn't need any retribution, and I went to my room. Mm-hmm. That part feels gut-wrenching to me. Any sense of why you began assuring everyone that everything was fine? Because let's not forget, 30 seconds ago, you are feeling roots and rocks against your back.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like I have to trust other people when I think about why I had to assure everyone everything was fine. I think that I knew that if I didn't do that, I was going to be opening myself up to more violence.
If you didn't do what?
If I didn't say, it's fine, I'm fine, no big deal. I don't know why I came in so upset, my bad. And then the going to my room for me was not it's not like a stomping off. That's like how I withdraw. Like I do that kind of unnoticed.
Well, and it's also how you regulate.
Yes.
Because you're dysregulated in this moment. You've been humiliated by your brother. You're physically hurt, and your mother has just left you utterly unprotected. And you are containing your brother's volatility. You're soothing everything that's happening. And you have to then go to your room and bear the immensity of the weight of the trauma of the moment for you.
Yes. Yeah, that feels very true. To say everything's fine and to kind of soothe both of them is my fastest route to getting to somewhere that I might feel safe, which would be by myself.
So there's never any containment or care for Kellay.
No. the story will be told as if there is.
Say more about that, Kellay.
I've never talked with my mom about this story, but I can think of other ones where I know that the way it's told is, and then I was able to help Kellay and some semblance of like kind of putting my brother in his place or something. Often like the stories about me that are told, it's always like with a laugh. Kellay was so upset, but there's a kind of surprising lack of shame on the part of my mom or my brother. Like in some ways, like this is not a secret. And I know I'm not supposed to talk about it.
And the way your mom deals with her quote unquote shame in this story is she says to your brother, you're going to mow the lawn, and Kellay, you're going to get to sip lemonade while he mows the lawn. Mm-hmm. The dilemma with that is that your brother already had to mow the lawn. And like you say in the story, you didn't want or need retribution. I love that line. You're saying you didn't need retribution. What did that 10-year-old girl need in that moment?
Definitely some kind of comfort, someone to attune to that was awful and to help me make sense of it. But probably more, in the moment, what I would have needed is just to know like that that's over and that I can have some level of trust that that's not going to happen again. And something I think I needed a lot that I never had. There was never any assurance or reason to think that he wouldn't do something again. That's a place that's hard to connect, but I know like that I would have needed to be attuned to. Yeah, I mean, even like the quote unquote punishment is my brother's so central to it, right? I often have a sense of like, I just don't want to be revolving around him.
I mean, what I think of just as a father of an 11-year-old daughter, I think of, I want to rush in there as your father and let you have a reaction.
Yeah.
To create some space and simply name to your brother, you humiliated your sister and you physically hurt her and you scared her. He's on top of you. Your hands are pinned. You're in a powerless position.
Yeah. Yes.
That's not even to say anything of the fact that you were so excited about this moment with your brother and getting time with him. I mean, there's so much in this story that we can't unpack. But for your father to simply come down and say, A, you were humiliated. Let's name what happened. Mm-hmm. And then let you have a frickin' reaction. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you were never allowed to have reactions. Not your own.
No, that feels very true. I mean, a word that keeps coming to mind now is space. Like if someone could have given me space, but I feel like I was always creating space for other people. I thought of myself as very unemotional for a very long time. And I think a lot of that was this sense of not being able to react or not being allowed, like there was no invitation to react in any way that was negative and it was very, my brother used to talk about how Kellay is emotionally distant.
Which is like stunning given your level of empathy. As a girl, I don't even mean now. I just mean as a girl.
That's true. Yeah. But yeah, he would say that to like my friends. It's hard to be friends with Kellay. She's pretty distant.
Right. She's emotionally distant. And the truth is there is no molecule of space in your home for you to connect with your own emotions.
Yes. Yeah.
Your story ends with you saying, I wanted there to be someone strong enough to stop him, to stop my brother. There wasn't, and there never would be. We've touched on this, but maybe just to explore it a little bit more, any sense of why neither your father nor your mother were willing to protect you from your brother's commitment to humiliate you?
Part of my sense is that they are afraid of him. Even still, it feels like they're scared. They're scared of him. And I mean, so in some ways I feel like that's founded. I'm not sure how they got to be scared, but I didn't, but
well, if I can interrupt for a minute.
Yeah.
It's not that you weren't scared of him. It's that you had the courage to engage him anyway.
Yeah.
Does that feel true, Kellay?
Yeah, that does feel true. That's very striking because the choices I've made as an adult have been predominantly in my relationship with him have been predominantly not to engage him. And that has really been extremely difficult for my mother, my father, and my sister.
Because you're repenting of your role.
Yeah. And what I hear a lot from my family is I just want our family back together.
I just want our family back together equates to, Kellay, you know what is expected of you. You know how much power you have to calm and soothe your brother. Let's get back to business as usual. And then you're scapegoated as the one who's somehow breaking up or disrupting the family.
Yeah. Yes.
So I just go back to my word. The truth is you are actually repenting, and not that it was sin of you to have this role. It was forced upon you, but you're doing it differently. You're doing a different course. You've changed direction, and you're like, this is not my task. I am a sister. I am not a mother, and I am not a father.
Yes. Yes, that feels very true.
At the beginning of the story, you said that your family was viewed as this model Christian family. How have you made sense of simultaneously knowing that everyone views us as this model Christian family, and yet your mother is utterly unwilling to protect you from your brother's humiliation? Like, how did you as a girl, or even now as a woman, make sense of that craziness?
I mean, I have really strong objections to patriarchy now. That's one direction I've taken, is to realize, like, wow, all the things I was taught about, because there was this sense of like, you need to submit to your brother kind of similarly to the way a good Christian wife submits to her husband. You know, as a kid, I said this already, I often just felt like, this isn't fair. This isn't fair. That was like as far as I could get in trying to make sense of it. As an adult, the obstacles are more around, how do I reconcile things I know to be true about my parents that are good and lovely, and their commitment to not see me. So I think that's kind of where I get foggy and confused. And part of me will want to say, like, she wasn't committed to, you know, him being able to humiliate me, but I've done enough work to be able to hear, like, actually, no, that's not true. Like, that's not true.
How has this story shaped you?
This story for me is a bit of a double-edged sword, because it's one of my few clear memories. Like, I have a sense of being treated this way by my brother, but I can't tell you very many specific stories. So sometimes I have felt like, oh, I'm just hanging on to this is just one thing that happened this one time. And yeah, it sounds pretty bad, but why am I so affected by it? And like always kind of searching for more, or trying to find, more reasons for why I am the way I am and I feel the way I do. And so I have an ambivalent relationship with the story, I would say. But I think as a woman and kind of recently, something I kind of purposefully didn't say but thought as I wrote the end was, I kind of had this realization of like, oh, now I can stop him, right? Like, I don't have to be in this position anymore. And it's making people angry and uncomfortable. I have to deal with a lot of guilt, but I really don't have to stay on the ground anymore. And like, I really can get up. And I've had some moments of feeling really powerful, just thinking the phrase, like, I'm standing up. I'm going to stand up, and that isn't dependent on my brother, and he's not central to that, which feels really healing for me. Like, I'm going to stand up, and I'm not going to be in this situation anymore. As I'm able to kind of play in those places, this story gives me a lot of autonomy, or makes me like more willing to use my own agency. And I think it's allowed me to see, I think this story, and in general, kind of the way I grew up, has allowed me to see a lot of subtle cruelty and be able to speak to that, right, in other people's lives, and try and offer other people more agency. So I very much can know things before I have words for them. It's kind of given me this ability to, I guess, just really connect with subtle harm, subtle abuse. I don't know. In some ways, it's not even a subtle story, but.
Well, it's Sorry to interrupt you, but there's harm in it that's not subtle, such as being dragged over the rocks and roots and being pinned down. But that's not the heart-wrenching part of the story for you.
Right.
What is?
I think the heart-wrenching part is, I mean, really, it's my mother.
Yeah.
Right? The sense that she's been watching.
Yep.
She didn't stop it, but she gets to be angry, but not in a way where I feel any comfort
or protection.
Yeah, because my moment in the story as a 10-year-old of like, here's how I'm going to make it through, is he went far enough. I will be protected. There will be some measure of this won't happen again, and not getting that, I think, is the most heart-wrenching.
Right. And that's the subtle harm that you are able now as a woman to see in others' stories because you lived it.
Yeah. I lead sexual abuse recovery groups kind of using the wounded heart, and I've been doing that since 2013. So I think definitely growing up in my family has given me a lot of tools that I don't necessarily, not that I wanted to get them the way I got them, but has allowed me to engage, people's stories of harm and abuse and not have to look away.
Mm-hmm. Last question before we end. How has your posture toward the girl in the story changed over the years?
So this actually is not the story I took the first time I went to the certificate program. You're asked to bring kind of what you asked me to do, a story from 0 to 18 that is somewhat traumatic. I took a story that actually didn't involve other people, which is really interesting to me now. It was just like a thing that happened to me medically. I was getting sick. But when I read the prompt, I thought of this moment with my brother, and I had always thought it was a funny story. I remember where I was sitting and thinking, it's so strange that I thought of a funny story when asked to write about something traumatic. My facilitator, she asked me, would you like to share a story where other people are involved? And I was like, well, I can tell you about this one thing that I thought of. I would say I moved from thinking it was kind of odd and funny and thinking the girl was kind of awkward and overly sensitive. And then I think that's shifted many times, kind of my posture towards her. But as I've gotten closer to her, I think I just have become a lot more aware of like how afraid I was. I was so far from that when I first thought of the story. And this is the first time I've rewritten it since my daughter has been like verbal. I think watching her has allowed me to realize how afraid I would have been and like how appropriate that is. So I think my posture has gotten closer to the fear, and then just been able to like slow down with her some. Even kind of reading it to you today, I felt like I was able to read it slower than I have before. So I think, I think that has to do with my posture too towards her. Like I don't have to be, it's okay to be with her.
It's hard to be with her.
Yes.
I mean, of course you would read this fast. This is a horrific story. It's not just horrific, but it's maddening.
Yeah. It's hard to be with her knowing that nothing is going to change. I think that has made me want to keep distance from her. I don't have a lot of hope to offer you is how I can feel. Surprisingly, it does actually in the end like feel good to be with her and to go slower.
Yes, because if there's anything that was lacking, it's that no one was ever with this 10-year-old Kellay. You were always alone in your room with your dysregulation.
Yes.
And so for you to read the story even a little bit slowly today shows that you are being with her. And there's a real sweetness to that.
Yeah. It's interesting how children can invite us to be with ourselves differently. I've been choosing to go into my daughter's room. I can be a little bit like, I've put you to bed and you're just going to have to deal with, whatever comes up for you now. But I think the pandemic and being pregnant, I've been invited to softer places. And so recently, if she really cries, and she's 2.5, so she's not an older kid yet, I'll go in and just be with her. And that's what I keep thinking, like, I'm just going to sit with you. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, I think like, this won't work. Like, I'm just going to encourage her to she's going to do it every night, but my experience has been like, it regulates me and her. And then I can put her to bed and she can fall asleep without crying. Those kinds of like places to play or try something different help me realize like, oh, I can be with me. I don't have to just leave me, like you're just going to have to deal with that.
Right. Well, Kellay, thank you so much for your vulnerability and for sharing this story with our listeners.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. Remember, if you want to get episodes as soon as they are released, please go to my website and click Get the App. It only costs $3 a month, and you will be helping to make the podcast possible. We will have a new episode in a couple of weeks.